for thousands of years, people have engaged in the act of smoking, long before the term itself even existed, and well before anyone spoke of drugs, prohibitions, or laws. In ancient cultures, individuals would burn the dried flowers of an unassuming plant, inhaling the smoke in search of healing, insight, or simply tranquility. What is often associated today with leisure, rebellion, or youthful exuberance was once a sacred ritual, a prayer, or a medical endeavor. The act of smoking carries a narrative that predates every civilization, a narrative that revolves around marijuana. This remarkable plant has accompanied various peoples, influenced religions, endured wars, and divided societies. It has served as a source of sustenance and medicine, while simultaneously embodying both taboo and hope. In ancient temples, it was offered as a sacrifice, sold in pharmacies, harvested in fields, and secretly smoked in backyards. Its reputation has shifted repeatedly. Sacred, dangerous, forbidden, rediscovered. Today, when one smokes, they unwittingly partake in an ancient practice, a connection between humanity and nature, between body and spirit that has persisted through millennia. This is the story of a plant that reveals more about humanity than about itself. Chapter 1. The Plant and Its Reputation. To understand the history of marijuana, one must first recognize that it has never been solely about a plant. Cannabis, as it is scientifically classified, is much more than a green-leafed organism with a distinctive aroma. It serves as a mirror of human culture, a companion in daily life and spirituality, in healing and prohibition. Since the dawn of settled human existence, people have utilized what surrounded them: grains for sustenance, animals for labor and clothing, and plants for healing and intoxication. Amidst this early connection to nature stood cannabis, modest yet remarkably versatile. Its fibers could be processed into textiles, ropes, and paper. Its seeds provided a nutritious source of oil and protein. And its flowers contained compounds that influenced both body and mind. It was this trifecta of utility, nourishment, and effect that rendered cannabis one of the oldest cultivated plants on Earth. Long before humans debated morality and law, this plant was an integral part of their daily lives. Archaeological discoveries reveal that hemp was deliberately cultivated in Asia over 10,000 years ago. In ancient vessels unearthed in China and Mongolia, residues of hemp seeds and oils have been found, indicating that the plant was not only gathered from the wild, but also consciously cultivated. In the early villages along the Yellow River, where agriculture and animal husbandry flourished, people utilized hemp for clothing, ropes, and nets. It was a material that offered strength and durability, lighter than animal hides yet more resilient than grass or flax. From this practical application gradually emerged a symbolic value, intertwining the plant with the very fabric of human existence. In the oldest Chinese texts, cannabis is referred to as one of the 5 sacred grains that nourished humanity. In India, it was regarded as a divine gift, believed to purify both body and spirit. Early on, the plant began to embody 2 distinct meanings, one of utility and the other of effect. Humans discovered that the dried flowers of hemp, when burned or consumed, induced a transformation of consciousness. This experience was sought after in religious rituals as much as it was in healing practices. During this formative period, marijuana was neither threatening nor forbidden. It was a tool, a natural remedy that was understood and utilized. While other plants merely provided sustenance, cannabis opened doors to the inner world. It alleviated pain, quelled hunger, expanded thoughts, and facilitated sleep. This dual nature made it unique, and perhaps that is why it later became a subject of controversy. For what brings healing can also lead to misuse, and what promises enlightenment often evokes fear. In the early history of humanity, however, there was no fear, only curiosity. People were both explorers and gatherers, taking what nature offered. Cannabis thrived in diverse climates, adapting to various conditions and spreading across continents with migrating tribes. Following the paths of early traders, it made its way westward, where new cultures were introduced to its properties. Thus began a story that was never linear but rather branched out in many directions. It existed in the spaces between daily life and intoxication, craftsmanship and healing, reverence and distrust. The reputation of marijuana during this time was neither sacred nor perilous. It was simply a part of the world, as natural as grain, fire, or water. It was only later that its name would become associated with notions of prohibition, morality, and control. Yet in those early centuries, it was a plant like any other, one that connected humanity to itself in ways they had yet to fully comprehend. Chapter 2: The Origins. Long before the first cities emerged, before humans inscribed symbols on clay tablets or forged tools from metal, cannabis flourished across the vast plains of Central Asia. In a land where the wind swept coldly over the steppe and the sun parched the earth, a resilient plant thrived, adapting like few others. It was modest, hardy, and possessed a quiet tenacity. In this barren landscape, its story began long before anyone could fathom the profound impact it would one day have on humanity. Here lived nomadic groups, hunters and gatherers who were closely connected to nature. They understood the benefits of every herb, knew which plants offered healing, which provided nourishment, and which inspired dreams. Among these plants, cannabis was unremarkable in appearance, yet rich in potential. From its stalks, fibers could be extracted that were stronger than grass and more flexible than animal sinew. Its seeds were pressed to yield oil or ground into a nutritious paste. Hidden within its flowers was a substance that altered the senses, slowing down and deepening thought. Humans soon recognized that this plant offered more than mere clothing or sustenance. It also influenced consciousness. The earliest archaeological findings from the regions now known as China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan provide evidence that hemp was cultivated deliberately more than 10,000 years ago. Researchers have discovered remnants of hemp oil in clay pots, while ancient graves contained seeds and charred flower remains, suggesting that they were burned during ritualistic practices. It is quite possible that early humans believed the smoke could purify the spirit or establish a connection to something greater. Such practices have recurred across millennia in numerous cultures. Perhaps the initial encounters with the plant were coincidental or born from observation. Those who inhaled the smoke of the dried flowers experienced a transformation, a sense of calm, or an elevation of thought. In societies where spirituality was closely intertwined with nature, such experiences were likely regarded as divine. Thus, cannabis found its place early on, bridging the gap between everyday use and spirituality. As migrating tribes spread across the Asian continent, the plant followed along routes that would later evolve into trade pathways. Over centuries, it accompanied people who settled down and engaged in agriculture. Where fields flourished, so did hemp. It was sown, harvested, and sown again, a silent companion to human advancement. From the valleys of northern China, the plant journeyed westward, traversing mountains and rivers, carried by herders and traders. This marked the beginning of the spread of a crop that acquired new names in many languages, but retained the same fundamental significance everywhere. A plant that provided, healed, and touched the spirit. In this early epoch, long before any laws or dogmas were established, cannabis was part of the natural cycle. Humans took from the earth what it offered, and cannabis was among its oldest gifts. As early cultures evolved into advanced civilizations, cannabis became an integral part of their healing practices and spiritual beliefs. In China, recognized as perhaps the oldest center of hemp cultivation, the plant was seen as a gift from nature capable of influencing both body and mind. In the oldest medical texts attributed to the legendary Emperor Shennong, which date back approximately 4,000 years, hemp is described as a remedy for pain, rheumatism, and malaria. Its seeds, rich in oil and nutrients, were also utilized as a tonic. In this context, cannabis was neither forbidden nor feared. Rather, it was simply viewed as part of natural medicine, much like ginseng or ginger. In India, the cannabis plant acquired a profoundly different significance. It was not merely regarded as a medicinal herb, it was considered sacred. In the Vedas, the oldest religious texts of the Indian subcontinent, cannabis is identified as one of the 5 holy plants that brings joy, dispels fear, and calms the spirit. From its leaves and flowers, a beverage known as bhang is prepared, which continues to be used in religious ceremonies, particularly in honor of the deity Shiva. In this belief system, cannabis is viewed as a divine gift, serving as a bridge between the material and spiritual realms. Those who consumed it sought not intoxication, but rather a closeness to the divine. The plant was also recognized in ancient Egypt. Medical papyri such as the Ebers papyrus from the 2nd millennium before Christ describe mixtures that included hemp used for alleviating inflammation and pain. Remnants of the plant have been found in burial sites, suggesting that cannabis played a role in both medical and possibly ritualistic practices. In Mesopotamia, situated between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, the plant appears in cuneiform texts, primarily associated with medicinal recipes for treating fevers and mental ailments. Over the centuries, knowledge of cannabis spread along trade routes that connected Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean. With merchants and healers, the seeds of the plant found their way into new lands, where they adapted and acquired new meanings. The ancient Greeks recognized hemp primarily as a utility plant for making ropes and textiles, yet their physicians also noted its therapeutic effects. The physician Dioscorides, who lived in the 1st century after Christ, mentioned cannabis as a remedy for earaches and inflammation. The plant was also well known in the Roman Empire. It thrived in gardens and was utilized in both medicine and craftsmanship. For many ancient cultures, cannabis was a plant with dual characteristics. It could be both beneficial and healing, yet it also had the potential to alter consciousness. This ambivalence rendered it fascinating, yet difficult to categorize. Nevertheless, for millennia, it was regarded as a gift of nature rather than a danger. It was only much later, as religions and rulers began to exert control over body and mind, that its significance began to shift. In the ancient world, marijuana was a familiar companion, a plant that healed, comforted, and, in the eyes of many, contained a piece of the divine. Chapter 4: Across Continents. With the rise of ancient civilizations, cannabis began to spread far beyond its original homeland. Traders, warriors, and travelers carried seeds, fibers, and stories about the plant, allowing it to reach lands that scarcely knew one another. Along the ancient trade routes, which would later be known as the Silk Road, hemp became a quiet yet valuable commodity. Between the vast steppes of Central Asia and the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, bundles of dried plants, oils, and fabrics made from hemp fibers traveled across ancient trade routes. Among those who utilized cannabis in unique ways were the Scythians, a nomadic people from the plains. The 5th century Greek historian Herodotus noted that the Scythians would throw hemp seeds onto hot stones and inhale the rising smoke. He wrote, "They do this after the burial of a companion as a purification of the body and spirit, and they derive joy from it." Archaeological discoveries in Scythian graves lend credence to these accounts. Artfully crafted vessels have revealed remnants of hemp, often found alongside weapons, jewelry, and offerings. For the Scythians, cannabis was an integral part of their spiritual life, serving as a gateway between the realms of the living and the dead. From these steppes, cannabis migrated westward, reaching Persia and the region of present-day Iran. Ancient texts and traditions from this area reference the plant in both medicinal and ritual contexts. Some researchers speculate that cannabis was included in preparations used during religious ceremonies, such as the sacred drink known as heima. From Persia, hemp made its way into the Greek world, initially recognized as a resource for ropes, textiles, and sails. The Greeks quickly acknowledged the strength of its fibers, as well as its healing properties. The physician Dioscorides mentioned hemp in his writings as a remedy for inflammation and pain, while Plutarch noted that certain people smoked the plant to experience joy and warmth. In the Roman Empire, hemp became an integral part of daily life. Pliny the Elder documented its use in medicine and crafts. Hemp was cultivated in the provinces of Gaul, Germania, and Hispania, where the climate and soil proved favorable. From its fibers, ropes, nets, and fabrics were produced, while its seeds provided oil for lamps and sustenance. Through the maritime routes established by the Romans, the plant eventually reached North Africa. In Egypt and Ethiopia, it was utilized in healing practices, while in other regions of Africa, it found its way into ritualistic acts. Particularly in southern Africa, cannabis became a component of ceremonies believed to connect the living with their ancestors through the smoke. Thus, cannabis transcended continents, uniting people who had never met. In the East, it was regarded as sacred, while in the West, it was seen as useful, yet universally it was revered. In an era when the world was still divided by mountains, deserts, and seas, this remarkable plant overcame boundaries without conquest or coercion. It traveled in the hands of traders and farmers, finding new soils, new meanings, and new names. In antiquity, cannabis existed as a plant devoid of guilt, law, and fear. It served humanity, as it always had, as a fiber, a remedy, and a companion in the moments that bridged work, faith, and the transient nature of life. And while empires rose and fell, cannabis remained, unassuming yet steadfast, a green thread connecting the ancient worlds. Chapter 5. Between East and West. During the Middle Ages, that extensive epoch between the splendor of antiquity and the awakening of the modern era, the history of marijuana took on a new form. Following the collapse of the Roman Empire, much of the ancient knowledge in Europe was lost. However, in the East, within the realms of Islam, this knowledge was preserved, expanded, and reinterpreted. In cities such as Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, science flourished, and with it, medicine. Arab scholars were well acquainted with cannabis. In the writings of physicians like Avicenna, the renowned author of the Canon of Medicine, references to the plant as a remedy for pain, inflammation, and insomnia can be found. It was also employed to stimulate appetite, provide calmness, and treat fevers. Yet, while the medical use was respected, cannabis gained a new and broader significance during this time. From the heart of the plant, hashish was derived, a concentrated form whose effects were stronger and longer lasting. Especially in the cities of the Near East, the use of hashish spread as a recreational substance, a source of comfort, and for some, a gateway to mystical experiences. The Sufis, the ascetic mystics of Islam, utilized hashish in certain sects as a means to open the mind and experience the divine presence more intensely. For them, the plant was not a vice but a tool on the path to inner enlightenment. However, religious authorities viewed this with concern. While the Quran explicitly forbade the consumption of wine, it remained silent on hashish, creating a gray area where spirituality and morality intersected. Some scholars condemned its use as a deviation, while others tolerated it quietly, as long as it did not lead to excess. Hashish became known throughout the Islamic world, from Persia to North Africa, finding its way into coffee houses, gardens, and markets of the great cities. In Egypt, particularly in 13th century Cairo, its use became so widespread that rulers repeatedly attempted to ban it. Yet no edict could displace the plant from the lives of the people. Its roots were too deep, it grew too easily, and its comfort in times of war, hunger, and illness was too significant. In contrast, the development in Europe followed a different path. Here, hemp remained primarily an agricultural crop. It provided fibers for ropes, textiles, and paper, serving as a foundation for sails, nets, and clothing. Its intoxicating properties were hardly known, and when they were mentioned, it was often in a dismissive tone. The Church, which kept a vigilant watch over both body and spirit, harbored a deep mistrust of anything that altered consciousness. While hemp was cultivated in monastery gardens, it was regarded solely as a practical raw material rather than a remedy. The ancient knowledge of its medicinal properties survived only in folk medicine, manifesting in the form of ointments and poultices that contained hemp oil or infusions meant to alleviate pain. However, these applications remained hidden, far from official recognition. Thus, while in the East the spiritual and medical significance of cannabis thrived, in the West it stagnated into mere agricultural use. Nevertheless, reports of hashish began to make their way to Europe along trade routes connecting the Arab and European worlds. Merchants spoke of the smoking rituals practiced in the Orient, while travelers described the customs of foreign lands, often with fascination and sometimes with moral outrage. As a result, cannabis became perceived in European consciousness as something foreign and exotic, associated with the mysterious cultures of the East. In the Middle Ages, it symbolized the divide between the Orient and the Occident, representing two worlds connected by the same plant yet understood in vastly different ways. Chapter 6: The Hemp of the West. While cannabis remained intertwined with spirituality and healing in the East, it evolved in the West into one of the most important crops of the Middle Ages. Hemp was ubiquitous, yet its reputation was purely practical. In 12th and 13th century Europe, nearly every village and town relied on hemp. Its fibers provided the material needed for ropes, sails, clothing, and paper. During a time when maritime trade was becoming increasingly significant, hemp was indispensable. Without it, ships could not have sailed, fishermen could not have cast their nets, and mills that depended on strong ropes would have ceased to function. Entire regions specialized in hemp cultivation, particularly in areas with moist climates such as Flanders, northern France, Italy, and the German territories along the Rhine. Farmers often planted hemp alongside grains and flax. As a robust plant requiring little care, it enriched the soil. After harvesting, the stalks were soaked in water to separate the fibers, a laborious yet rewarding process that ensured many families could make a living. The use of hemp was so commonplace that hardly anyone spoke of its potential intoxicating effects. The European varieties typically contained only small amounts of the substances that could alter the mind, and people were more interested in the practical benefits than in the effects on consciousness. However, knowledge of the plant persisted in medicine, albeit in a modest form. Healers recognized hemp seeds as a mild remedy for inflammation and as a calming ingredient in ointments. In certain monasteries, hemp oil was utilized to alleviate pain and treat skin diseases. The monks, who diligently gathered the knowledge of antiquity, preserved scattered references from the writings of Dioscorides and Pliny, although they seldom attributed significant importance to these texts. Hemp was an integral part of daily life. It was neither a secret nor a cult. Its presence was so commonplace that it hardly warranted mention. With the rise of maritime exploration in the late Middle Ages, hemp eventually emerged as a strategic commodity. The sails of the grand ships, which were intended to connect Europe with distant continents, were made from hemp fabric, as were the ropes that secured them. Entire kingdoms encouraged the cultivation of hemp to supply their fleets. England, for instance, enacted laws mandating landowners to grow hemp in order to bolster the navy. Sailors claimed that without hemp, there would be no maritime power. The material that conquered the world's oceans originated from the fields of farmers. Simultaneously, knowledge of hemp's intoxicating effects began to resurface quietly. Merchants returning from the Middle East brought reports of hashish, and in some port cities, small quantities started to appear. However, in Christian Europe, this remained a peripheral phenomenon. The prevailing belief in moderation and order left little room for experimentation with substances that altered consciousness. Thus, cannabis in the West remained what it had always been, a useful plant indispensable for the economy and daily life, yet lacking greater spiritual significance. Nevertheless, medieval hemp possessed a cultural strength that is often overlooked. It was woven into clothing, tools, ships, and books. Without hemp ropes, no bell tower would have rung. Without hemp paper, many of the great manuscripts of that era would never have come into existence. Thus, the plant, revered elsewhere as sacred, was simply the backbone of craftsmanship and trade in Europe. It bore the weight of the world without receiving particular honor. It would not be until centuries later that its image would shift once again, as utility hemp would become the subject of a complex new debate. However, during the Middle Ages, it was simply what humanity valued most: reliable, useful, and found everywhere. Chapter 7: New Worlds, New Meanings. With the great voyages of discovery in the early modern period, a new chapter began for hemp. As European ships set sail across the ocean starting in the 15th century, hemp was present in every plank and every rope. The sails were crafted from hemp fabric, and the ropes that held the masts were made from its fibers. Without hemp, European expansion would not have been possible. Thus, the plant accompanied explorers into the New World, initially as an indispensable material, and soon thereafter as a seed. Spanish and Portuguese colonists brought hemp to South America, while later the English and French introduced it to North America. By the 17th century, hemp had firmly established its role in the burgeoning new societies. In the 17th century, extensive hemp fields flourished across the colonies of Virginia, New England, and Canada. From its fibers, essential materials were produced, including sails, nets, uniforms, and paper, all of which were crucial for the burgeoning economies of these young societies. In North America, hemp soon found its way into medicinal use. Physicians during the colonial era recognized its pain-relieving properties, and by the 18th century, tinctures and extracts of hemp were commonly found in pharmacies. At that time, the term marijuana was not yet in use, and there was no distinction made between the various forms of the plant. Hemp was simply known as hemp, a useful crop that found applications across numerous domains. It was not until the 19th century that the intoxicating varieties of cannabis began to be more consciously acknowledged. European researchers and travelers, particularly those active in regions such as India, Egypt, and the Middle East, documented the consumption of hashish and ganja in their reports. Notably, the French physician Jacques Joseph more examined the effects of cannabis on the human mind in the mid-century. In Paris, he conducted experiments with hashish to explore the relationship between consciousness, imagination, and madness. His work sparked interest and ignited a wave of curiosity in the salons of European cities. Among artistic circles, particularly among writers of the Club des Hachishins, hashish briefly became a fashionable experiment, a substance that promised inspiration. Concurrently, cannabis began to be systematically utilized in Western medicine. In the year 1839, the Irish physician William Brooks Shea, who was working in India, published a comprehensive study on the medical applications of the plant. He described its efficacy in alleviating pain, cramps, and epilepsy. These observations led to cannabis extracts becoming widely available in pharmacies across Europe and North America. By the dawn of the 20th century, cannabis had established itself as a recognized medicinal substance in the Western world, available in forms such as tinctures, drops, and ointments. At the same time, hemp cultivation remained significant as an industrial crop. The fibers continued to be used for producing paper, textiles, and ship equipment, and in the United States, hemp was a staple of the agricultural landscape. However, the plant began to acquire two distinct identities. While hemp continued to be respected as a utility crop, the intoxicating form, increasingly referred to as marijuana, began to develop a new and exotic image. In Mexico and the southern United States, workers and immigrants consumed the plant for relaxation and music making. What was commonplace in other cultures appeared foreign and unsettling to the Western public. Newspapers began reporting on strange narcotics that were purportedly dangerous, and gradually a shadow began to loom over a plant that had accompanied humanity for thousands of years. Cannabis was still legal at this time, yet public attitudes were beginning to shift. The industrial world, which valued order, efficiency, and control, increasingly viewed anything that altered consciousness with suspicion. In the newly emerging societies of the Americas, the groundwork was laid for debates that would shape modern perspectives on issues such as freedom versus prohibition, benefit versus danger, and remedy versus intoxication. In the 19th century, cannabis was firmly established within Western medicine. Physicians prescribed tinctures to treat insomnia, pain, and anxiety, and pharmacies sold extracts in small glass vials. It was considered a gentle and versatile remedy that did not appear to cause dependency or pose significant risks. However, as scientific medicine advanced and new synthetic drugs emerged, the significance of cannabis began to wane. The difficulty in controlling dosages and the unpredictable effects of the plant meant that it was gradually overshadowed by the arrival of chemically precise medications like morphine and aspirin. Concurrently, the societal climate was changing. Western nations began to focus more on issues of morality, hygiene, and public order. Anything that did not conform to the ideal of discipline became increasingly suspect. In the United States, this development coincided with social tensions. By the year 1900, the country had become a melting pot of immigrants, cultures, and fresh ideas, and cannabis became part of this rich tapestry. Mexican laborers and musicians who arrived in the United States after the Civil War brought with them their own traditions of cannabis consumption, particularly the smoking of dried flowers, which they referred to as marijuana. This habit spread rapidly in the poorer neighborhoods of border towns, especially among working-class groups engaged in agriculture and fieldwork. However, American society did not view this as a cultural phenomenon, but rather as a threat. Newspapers began to cover the topic, linking the term marijuana with crime and debauchery. Suddenly, the plant that had previously been seen as a medicinal remedy in pharmacies was now portrayed as a dangerous narcotic, allegedly inciting violence and madness. This negative representation was not merely coincidental. Economic and political interests played a significant role, as did underlying racism. Industrial hemp was in competition with new synthetic fibers, and large chemical companies sought to control the market. At the same time, authorities were on the lookout for a new enemy to exert social control. By the 1930s, the campaign against cannabis reached its peak. Harry Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, launched a nationwide propaganda effort that associated marijuana with crime, immorality, and social decay. Posters and films, such as Reefer Madness, depicted young people succumbing to madness or engaging in violent behavior after smoking the substance. This marked a significant turning point in the perception of cannabis, transforming it from a widely accepted medicinal plant into a symbol of societal threat and moral panic. It was a time of fear, and cannabis became a symbol of the unknown, the foreign, and the dangerous. In this charged atmosphere, the American Congress enacted the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively criminalizing possession and trade of the substance. This pivotal moment marked the beginning of a wave of international prohibitions that spread in the ensuing decades. Countries closely allied with the United States adopted similar legislation. What had been revered for millennia as a plant of healing, meditation, and labor was now transformed into a figure of enmity. In Europe, This attitude was largely adopted without reflection. Newspapers and politicians warned of the new drugs coming from America, and by the 1950s, cannabis was regarded almost universally as a dangerous substance devoid of any benefit. This once wholly useful plant had, in the eyes of modern society, become a symbol of loss of control. The very people who had once revered it began to fear it. Yet, as so often occurs in history, a period of fear eventually gave way to doubt. From this doubt, a new movement would emerge in the latter half of the century, challenging the long-standing reputation of the plant. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the world entered a new era characterized by order, progress, and control. However, amidst the rebuilding, technological advancements, and political tensions, a generation arose that questioned this established order. During those years, cannabis became almost universally banned, evolving into a symbol of resistance. What had been deemed a dangerous drug for decades was transformed in the hands of the youth into an emblem of freedom and self-determination. In the United States, where laws were particularly stringent, young people found expression in music, art, and literature that consciously diverged from bourgeois morality. The scent of marijuana became intertwined with this movement, alongside long hair, colorful clothing, and protest songs against war and injustice. In the parks of San Francisco, in the basements of New York, and at festivals of those years, people gathered to smoke together, not merely for pleasure but as an expression of a way of life that defied societal norms. The act of smoking cannabis became a quiet form of resistance, a symbol against war, materialism, and political hypocrisy. At the same time, the state responded with severity. In the 1950s and 60s, many countries intensified their drug laws. In the United States, the Controlled Substances Act classified cannabis in the same category as heroin and cocaine, labeling it a substance without medical value and with a high potential for abuse. This classification had far-reaching consequences. Millions of individuals were arrested in the following decades for minor possession, particularly in impoverished neighborhoods and among minority communities. Governments in Europe and Asia adopted similar policies, echoing the American approach to cannabis regulation. International drug policy, supported by the United Nations, emphasized punishment over education. Cannabis became a symbol of societal control loss, and those who consumed it were often labeled as outsiders or criminals. However, while political measures sought to criminalize its use, scientific inquiry began to resurface. In the 1960s, Israeli chemists uncovered the structure of the primary active compound in cannabis, DC, paving the way for a new medical perspective. Researchers started to gain a deeper understanding of the plant's effects, discovering that it interacts with a specific system in the body known as the endocannabinoid system, which is involved in numerous processes such as pain, sleep, appetite, and mood regulation. These findings contradicted the narrative of cannabis as a dangerous drug that had been perpetuated by political rhetoric. Nevertheless, public opinion was not yet ready for change. As the 1970s unfolded, the counterculture movement began to expand. With the rise of the hippie movement and civil rights protests, cannabis firmly established itself as a symbol of liberation. Musicians, artists, and intellectuals openly discussed their use of the substance, prompting society to begin differentiating its views on cannabis. Some states in the United States eased their laws regarding cannabis possession, while in parts of Europe, the possession of small amounts was tolerated. Despite these shifts, the overarching global trend remained punitive. The war on drugs policy, which peaked in the 1980s under President Ronald Reagan, intensified repression once again. Cannabis use became equated with crime and moral decay, leading entire generations to grow up believing that smoking marijuana was a perilous act. Yet beneath the surface, a different reality persisted. Millions of people around the globe continue to use cannabis discreetly in their daily lives. For some, It served as a recreational substance, while for others, it acted as a form of self-therapy for pain, anxiety, or sleep disorders. While governments fought against what they did not understand, the plant remained an integral part of human life. In subcultures within music, on city streets, and in the quiet homes of users, an ancient relationship endured hidden yet unbroken. The counterculture of the 1960s had achieved more than many realized. It brought cannabis out of the shadows of mere criminality into the light of societal discourse. From this movement, a new phase began to emerge in the following decades, one in which the narrative surrounding the plant would be rewritten, not merely as a symbol of rebellion, but once again as a part of nature and medicine. As the 1990s commenced, cannabis remained illegal in many parts of the world. However, the tone of the debate began to shift, hinting at the changes to come. After decades of criminalization, the question gradually arose whether the plant that had long been demonized might indeed possess medicinal value. An increasing number of doctors, researchers, and patients began to reconsider the ancient knowledge surrounding cannabis. In the United States, where the war on drugs had incarcerated countless individuals, the number of those utilizing cannabis as a pain reliever or to alleviate severe illnesses grew significantly. Cancer patients reported that cannabis helped them combat nausea following chemotherapy treatments. Individuals suffering from multiple sclerosis found that it alleviated their spasms and cramps, while AIDS patients noted that it restored their appetite. These personal accounts directly contradicted the official narrative that depicted cannabis as both useless and dangerous. Initial clinical studies began to confirm that the active compounds within the plant indeed held therapeutic potential. Researchers discovered the endocannabinoid system within the human body, a complex network of receptors and signaling molecules involved in numerous processes, ranging from pain perception and immune responses to mood regulation and sleep patterns. This groundbreaking discovery transformed the understanding of cannabis. It was no longer viewed merely as a foreign intoxicant, but rather as a plant that interacted directly with the human organism. During these pivotal years, the first countries began to permit medical cannabis use. In California, citizens voted in favor of the Compassionate Use Act, which granted patients with severe illnesses access to cannabis for medical purposes. From this point, the movement began to spread, initially to other states across the US, then to Canada, Israel, the Netherlands, and eventually to Germany. A gradual distinction began to emerge between medical and recreational use. While advancements in medical applications progressed, the political landscape remained fraught with contradictions. Cannabis continued to be classified internationally as a dangerous drug, yet an increasing number of countries began to acknowledge its therapeutic benefits. Public perception also underwent a significant shift. Patients, doctors, and scientists began to speak openly about the advantages of cannabis, while media reports highlighted individual stories that further accelerated this change. The plant, once regarded as a symbol of rebellion, evolved into a beacon of hope for modern medicine. New products were developed, including oils, sprays, and capsules, which allowed for more precise dosing. Pharmaceutical companies started to industrially process cannabis extracts, and research increasingly focused on isolating and effectively utilizing the active compounds. However, the discourse surrounding cannabis remained riddled with contradictions. While patients sought relief, critics accused advocates of opening the floodgates to complete legalization. In many countries, a dual reality emerged. Medical cannabis was permitted, yet the possession of small amounts for personal use remained illegal. This complex interplay of acceptance and restriction highlighted the ongoing struggle to reconcile the plant's medicinal potential with lingering societal apprehensions. This duality reflected the tension between tradition and modernity, as well as the conflict between science and politics. Despite all the controversies, the resurgence of the cannabis plant was unstoppable. In the early 21st century, a global shift began to take shape. An increasing number of states opened their doors to the medical use of cannabis. Universities systematically researched its effects, and even conservative politicians had to concede that cannabis was more than just a recreational drug. The plant returned to the hands of healers, much like it had in ancient times. However, this time, it was not merely based on ancient practices, but was supported by scientifically validated knowledge that renewed its reputation. Cannabis had found its way out of illegality and into laboratories, clinics, and legislative bodies, transforming from a symbol of resistance into a legitimate instrument of medicine. Ancient as humanity itself, yet newly understood. Chapter 11, the 21st Century, From Taboo to Industry. With the dawn of the 21st century, cannabis entered a new phase in its long and storied history. After centuries of reverence, prohibition, and persecution, the plant suddenly became the focal point of a global re-evaluation. What was once seen as a symbol of rebellion and law-breaking was now the subject of economic interests, medical research, and political reform. Governments in an increasing number of countries began to reconsider outdated laws. Canada, Uruguay, Mexico, and numerous U.S. states fully or partially legalized cannabis, initially for medical purposes and later for recreational use as well. Europe followed more cautiously, but even in regions where possession remained officially criminalized, societal attitudes began to shift. Consumption became tolerated, penalties softened, and public perception grew more rational. The language surrounding cannabis evolved. What was once termed drug abuse became known as cannabis consumption, and addiction treatment shifted towards regulation. Simultaneously, a new industry emerged. In the United States, companies began to grow, process, and market cannabis professionally. Laboratories, packaging firms, and research centers sprang up. In Canada and Israel, scientists developed new strains with varying ratios of active ingredients to enable targeted medical applications. From a previously prohibited substance, cannabis became a multi-billion-dollar economic factor. The plant, which had long existed in the shadows of the law, suddenly found itself traded on stock exchanges, included in investment funds, and sought after by investors. This transformation also altered its cultural significance. Cannabis was no longer merely a symbol of counterculture, it had become an integral part of the global economy. However, this change brought forth new questions. How can a plant so deeply rooted in human history be regulated effectively? How can society prevent economic interests from overshadowing the plant's original significance? While some viewed the legalization of cannabis as a triumph of reason, others warned of a commercialization that transformed a rich cultural heritage into a mere business venture. The once revered plant of farmers, healers, and seekers was now being cultivated in sterile environments, standardized, analyzed, and packaged for sale. At the same time, it remained prohibited for many individuals, particularly in impoverished regions, highlighting the stark inequalities in global justice. In the realm of medicine, research continued to advance. New cannabis-based medications received approval, allowing patients access to prescription formulations, while an increasing number of physicians advocated for their controlled use. Studies confirmed the effectiveness of cannabis in treating chronic pain, epilepsy, and anxiety disorders. Nevertheless, political hesitation persisted. A tension emerged between medical progress and societal skepticism, a dynamic that remains relevant to this day. Simultaneously, a new culture of consumption began to take shape. In cities around the globe, licensed establishments known as dispensaries sprang up, selling cannabis akin to wine or coffee, available in various strains, strengths, and forms. Edibles, beverages, oils, and creams began to replace traditional smoking products. The scent that once marked the underground now wafted legally through the streets of Denver, Toronto, and Amsterdam. Thus, the 21st century became an era of contradictions. Cannabis emerged as both a symbol of freedom and an industrial product, a remedy and a lifestyle, a reminder of ancient cultures and an expression of modern economics. The plant managed to establish itself in a world that had long ostracized it. Its journey from taboo to industry was not merely a shift in legislation, but also a reflection of humanity itself, its capacity to prohibit, to fear, to explore, and ultimately to understand. As the new century dawned, cannabis stood, as it always had, a mirror of human culture, a gift from nature that, depending on the prevailing zeitgeist, could be perceived as a remedy, a drug, or a commodity, with a narrative that is far from over. At the conclusion of this extensive journey, we find a plant as ancient as civilization itself, a silent companion throughout human history. Cannabis has borne more identities than any other plant, revered and cursed, respected and persecuted, forgotten and rediscovered. In the earliest villages, it served as food and fiber. In temples, it acted as a bridge to the divine. In farmers' workshops, it was a tool, and in the streets of modernity, it became a symbol of both freedom and prohibition. No other plant reflects the contradictions of human culture as vividly, illustrating how humanity grapples with that which heals and transforms, and with what it cannot fully control. The story of marijuana is, at its core, a narrative about humanity itself, its yearning for relief, understanding, and transcendence beyond the mundane. This tale intertwines curiosity and fear, power and morality, encapsulating the eternal tension between order and freedom. Throughout history, humanity has endeavored to tame cannabis, employing it as a remedy, a commodity, and an object of legislation. Yet, the plant consistently eludes simple categorization. It flourishes where it chooses, adapts to various environments, and endures through empires, religions, and ideologies. In today's age, characterized by scientific advancement and industrial progress, it seems that humankind has finally grasped the complexities of cannabis. However, perhaps the reality is quite the opposite. Perhaps it is cannabis that teaches us the limitations of our understanding of nature and consciousness. This remarkable plant reveals the intricate connections between body and mind, nature and culture. It illustrates that healing and intoxication, benefit and risk are not opposites but rather facets of the same experience that has accompanied humanity for millennia. Thus, this narrative does not conclude with a definitive ending. Instead, it circles back to a plant that serves as a reminder of our intrinsic connection to nature. Cannabis has provided us with clothing, nourishment, comfort, and thoughts that transcend the visible realm. As its leaves rustle in the wind, it remains what it has always been, a plant that quietly narrates who we are and how deeply we long for connection to the earth, to the spirit, and to one another. This is the ongoing story of marijuana, a tale that continues with each seed that falls into the soil and with every individual who finds a moment of tranquility in the smoke of bygone eras.